All right, so in this video, we are going to go over our books project overview. Now, this is the first project we are going to be creating using FastAPI, where we're going to be going over all the basic HTTP request methods and really learning how to use FastAPI. So what will we be creating? Well, we're going to be creating and enhancing books to learn the basics of FastAPI. So essentially, we're going to have a list of books. And these books are going to have a key value pair attached. So a title is going to have a value, an author is going to have a value, and a category is going to have a value. We're going to name the titles from Title 1 to Title 5, our authors from Author 1 to Author 5, and then our categories are going to have a few different ones like science, history, and math. Now, regarding these books, we are going to be using the CRUD operations. And CRUD stands for create, read, update, and delete. So essentially, we're going to be creating new books to go on this list. We're going to be able to get and read all of these books. We're going to be able to enhance or update specific books and be able to delete books from this list. But first, let's go over request and response. So if we remember, we're going to have a web page, and the web page is going to be able to communicate with a FastAPI application. So the web page is going to send a request to the FastAPI server, and FastAPI is going to send a response back to the web page. So think of the request being, hey, I want to see book 2 and 4, and then FastAPI is going to return book 2 and 4. However, when the web page is going to be requesting information from FastAPI, it's going to request it by using HTTP request methods. Now, these HTTP request methods are a way for the web page to communicate to the server what type of request they are asking for. And think of it kind of like CRUD operations, which again are create, read, update, and delete. Now, luckily, FastAPI has something called Swagger UI implemented within the application already. And now Swagger UI is easy to get to. It's going to be just the URL that FastAPI spins up /docs, which will bring us to the Swagger UI, which is going to have a list of all of the request methods we are able to call from FastAPI. And I'll be going over all of this step by step. So HTTP request methods have their own verbs attached to the CRUD operations that we need to use within our application. So create in HTTP request methods is considered a post. Read is considered a get, and update is considered a put, and a delete is considered a delete, which is nice. So the very first thing we're going to be going over within our FastAPI application is how to create a GET request method so we can read and return information back to the client who is requesting information from FastAPI. And with that, let's jump into the code and create our first FastAPI endpoint. All right, so in this video, we are going to go over the GET HTTP request method. So we're going to be creating a FastAPI application. And the very first thing we're going to do is create a new file called books.py. And now inside books.py, we need to say from FastAPI, import FastAPI. This will allow us to be able to use all of the dependencies that we just installed to our environment of FastAPI. We then want to say app equals FastAPI, which now allows us to use those dependencies that came with FastAPI in a variable within our application. And then we're going to say @app.get with a path of /API endpoint, where we have our Python function of async def first API, where we're going to return message of hello Eric. But let's dive into the first function a little bit. So we have our Python function of async def first API return message of hello Eric. Now, in the very beginning, we can see async, which stands for asynchronous. Now, that is not needed in FastAPI, but I'm going to be explicit and use async in every function that we create that is an API endpoint for this course. Now, that async is not needed in FastAPI because if it is an asynchronous function, FastAPI will add the asynchronous functionality behind scenes. Well, as of right now, this is just a Python function, and we want it to have the ability to be able to read information or send information back to the client. Well, this is considered a GET HTTP request method. So this function, we need to add an API endpoint so the client can consume this Python function. And we can do this by adding a decorator above the Python function of @app.get, and now we can specify the API endpoint that will call this function. And we're going to specify it as API-endpoint. So when we start the application, FastAPI is going to spin up the URL of 127.0.0.1 on our port 8000. And now if we go to this URL /API endpoint, we are going to get the response from FastAPI, which is a new dictionary that just says message of hello Eric. So the API endpoint that we're adding is just the path or the URL path to be able to call this Python function. So you might be wondering, well, how do we start a FastAPI application? So we have our function and we have our FastAPI application. And we have the ability to get this information from our API endpoint. Well, we're going to have to open up our terminal to be able to run our FastAPI application. And inside our terminal, we are going to say unicorn books::app -- reload. Now, unicorn is the web server that comes installed with FastAPI. Books is the Python file that we are referring to, which has an app that is equal to FastAPI. So if you remember in the very beginning, we imported FastAPI. We're going to say app equals FastAPI all within our books.py file. So we're saying books::app, and then -- reload will allow our application to reload every time there's a code change. So once we type in this command, we are going to get 127.0.0.1, which is our local host, port 8000 live to be able to contact our FastAPI application. Now remember, we're going to have this books object, which is going to have 5 different books with a title 1 through title 5, authors through author 1 through author 5, and categories with a couple different categories involved. So we're going to have our application of app.get API endpoint, but now we're going to change the response from message of hello Eric to return books. This will return the list of books of every book we currently have. So if we go to the URL of our local host port 8000 and we do /API endpoint, this will essentially return all the books that we have currently in that list. However, the API endpoint of /API-endpoint doesn't really make sense or tell the client that we are about to return all the books. So let's go ahead and just get rid of that, and let's change it to @app.get/books so the user knows they're going to get books when they hit this URL. And then we're going to have this function of read all books, return books. So now if the user goes to 127.0.0.1 port 8000, they go to /books, which will return all of the books that the FastAPI application currently has. Now, without further ado, let's jump into the code and let's create these API endpoints so we can return all the books back to the user. All right, now that we've created our virtual environments, let's now go ahead and open up our directory of FastAPI, and let's create our first FastAPI application and API endpoint. So let's go ahead and say open on PyCharm, Let's go to our directory wherever we created that FastAPI and where we have our FastAPI environment inside. And let's go ahead and say open. Now, when you click open, we're going to see that we have our FastAPI directory with our FastAPI environment within that directory where we're going to be creating our application. All right, now the very first thing we need to do is go down to our bottom right-hand corner where it says no interpreter, or it might create an interpreter for you, but we want to change that. So let's go down here and say add new interpreter. We're going to say add local interpreter. Let's go over here and say existing. And inside here, we want to change it to our FastAPI interpreter that we created using our virtual environment. So let's go ahead and go into our documents, our FastAPI environment. And inside our bin folder, if you are a Mac user, or inside your scripts folder, if you're a Windows user, let's go ahead and select our Python 3.11 or whatever your newest version of Python is. And then let's go ahead and say OK. OK again. And now we have our FastAPI environment working on our IDE. So that's exactly what we wanted. All right, now inside our directory, let's go ahead and say right click, new Python file, and we're going to name this file books. Now, the very first thing we need to do in books is import FastAPI. So we can say from FastAPI, import FastAPI. And now the very next thing we need to say is app equals FastAPI. This allows Unicorn to identify that, hey, we are creating a new application of FastAPI, and this is importing all of the resources that we got from the very top. Then we want to say async def first API and return a dictionary of message hello Eric. And now that we have this function, we now need FastAPI to acknowledge that, hey, this is an API endpoint. How can we now call this using our appropriate API verbs? Well, right above this function, we need to create a decorative. And we're going to say @app.get parentheses /. So let's recap what we did right here. We imported FastAPI from FastAPI. We are acknowledging that this is going to be a FastAPI application where we're setting app to what we're importing for FastAPI. We created our own Python function of async, which stands for asynchronous, def, which is our function call, first API, and we're going to return message of hello Eric. And we added this annotation at the top, which then allows FastAPI to know that at this path, we are going to be returning this method. So let's open up our terminal. Make sure your FastAPI environment is activated. And in here, we are going to say Unicorn books :app -- reload. And books is coming from the name of this file where our app is living. So books.py, and our app is living inside this. So we're saying books is our app. We're going to reload, and we're going to be calling our Unicorn. So let's go ahead and press enter. When we do this, we get this URL where our application is running. If we click this, it's going to show us hello Eric. So if I zoom in a little bit, we can see that it's going to print hello Eric. And that's because at our URL, we have a / at the end, which is exactly what our application is looking for of our URL with just an empty / of a get, which is going to return message hello Eric. Now, one thing to point out, if we remove asynchronous and we save, we can see our application reran. and we reopen up our URL and we refresh, we can still see that it says message hello Eric. So the async is fairly optional for FastAPI. Now we can stop the server by clicking Control-C, and that will stop our server from running. And there's a new way to be able to run FastAPI applications if you have the newest version of FastAPI installed. And we can do this by saying FastAPI run and then the Python file you're trying to start, so books.py. This will start up the production mode of your FastAPI CLI, which will do the exact same thing. Or we could also go ahead and say dev. If we type in dev right here, it's going to just bring up our development mode. And it's saying development mode and production mode because we can set up different instances within our code. But mostly for this course, I'm going to be using Uvicorn. So we're going to be doing Uvicorn books :app -- reload. And that's because underneath our FastAPI run, the file, it's going to be running this behind scenes. So I'm going to run the course from this command right here of the Uvicorn main :app -- reload. One thing to point out is that this slash is just going to be the end of our URL and port. And let's go ahead, instead of just doing an empty slash, let's go ahead and just say API-endpoint. All right, so now if we save the application and we open up our browser again, we can see if we refresh the page, we're going to get detail not found at this slash. So what we need to do now is just go ahead and say /API-endpoint. And now we're going to get our message of hello Eric back. And now we can see that it's our URL, our port on our computer, and then /API-endpoint. Just like right here, we are running FastAPI on that URL and port, and then /API-endpoint. All right, and now with that, this will wrap up this lecture on creating your first FastAPI application and our first API endpoint. And I will see you in the next video. Hey everybody, and welcome back to another lecture with Coding with Roby. And in this video, we are going to enhance our first API and our API endpoint to now return a list of books that we create. So we're going one step closer to making this a full application. So to start, we want our API endpoint to return a list of books. So we need to go ahead and create the list of books above. So the very first thing we can do is let's go ahead and say books, all in capital letters, equals a new list. And now inside this list, we are going to have key value pairs. So we can say curly brackets, title, and it's going to be title 1, comma, author of author 1, and category of science. Now I want a total of 6 books, so I'm going to just copy and paste this 5 more times. And I'm going to change each title to Title 2, Title 3, Title 4, Title 5, and Title 6. I'm going to change the authors to Author 2, Author 3, Author 4, Author 5, and the last one I'm just going to actually say Author 2 again. And then categories, I'm going to say science. The second book can be science. The third book, we're going to make history. And then the rest of them, we're going to make math. So the only discrepancy is book 6, where we're going to have our author, which is also Author 2. So Author 2 has wrote 2 books, Title 2 and Title 6. All right, so we have our books, which is a list, and we have 6 books inside. All right, so if we scroll down to our app.get API endpoint async def first API, let's just go ahead and right now just change this to books. So when we go to this API endpoint, we are going to get all of our books. So let's go ahead and open up our terminal and type uvicorn books:/app-reload. And now let's open up our application. And immediately we can see that nothing is found, and that's normal. So let's go ahead and say /API endpoint. And here we can see all of our books that we just wrote. Now, this is not that pretty and it's kind of hard to read, but FastAPI has something called Swagger that's automatically implemented with FastAPI. And Swagger will allow us to see all of our API endpoints. We'll be able to call our API endpoints, and we'll be able to see the response of each API endpoint. So right here, let's just go ahead and cross out API endpoint and let's type in docs. When you go to docs, you'll see that we are in our Swagger UI. It'll even say in the browser, and we get our first API, which is a GET request of API endpoint that says first API. We can open it up and then say try it out and click execute. And when we click execute, we can see that our API took no parameters. And here is the response from our FastAPI application, where we have a list of books. And here's all 6 of our books that we implemented in our application that our API is returning. Now, some things that we want to point out in Swagger is it's going to tell us our response, which is a 200, and we'll go over status codes in the future, but a 200 status code means everything was successful. Now, if we scroll up, we can see the URL, the request URL that called this API endpoint. And we can see that it's http:// our FastAPI URL with our port, and then / our API endpoint. Now, this API endpoint doesn't really make sense for returning all the books. So let's go back to our application. And let's go ahead and change this API endpoint to /books. And let's change this function of first API to read all books. Now, when you save the application, FastAPI is going to automatically restart. And that's because we did -- reload at the end of our command. That means every time there's a change in a saved file, reload our uvicorn server. So now if we go back into our Swagger UI and we refresh the page, we can now see that it's /books read all books. And if we say try it out and execute, the request URL is our localhost port 8000 /books. And it's going to have all of our books. Now don't forget, this is through the Swagger docs. We can also call this by just going straight to the URL that we created with our API endpoint, which is just 127.0.0.1 port 8000. And now we can just type in books, and that's going to return all of the information as well. But Swagger UI makes it a lot easier for us just to be able to see all of the API endpoints that we created and being able to call them in one spot. All right, now this wraps up the lecture on enhancing our API endpoint and adding some books that we get to return. And I will see you in the next video. In this video, we are going to go over path parameters. So what are path parameters? Well, path parameters are request parameters that have been attached to the URL. Path parameters are usually defined as a way to find information based on location. So let's think of a computer file system. You can identify the specific resource based on the file in the path you are in. So if you went to /users/codingwithroby, documents, Python, FastAPI section 1, you'd expect to see section 1 in this path. So let's say we have our request, our GET request method of localhost port 8000 /books. Well, if we look at our function, we can see @app.get /books async def read all books, and we're going to return all the books. What we can see is that the path at the end of the URL matches the path that we're expecting in our FastAPI application. Now, this is a static path because /books and books within the FastAPI application cannot be changed. We are deliberately saying /books. However, in FastAPI, you can make dynamic path parameters. So let's go ahead and say we have our request of read/get, and we have a new URL that's going to say localhost port 8000 /books/book1. Now, book1 is what the user is typing in, but the user could also say book 2, or book 3, or book 4, or book all the way up to how many books are in the application. Now, based on each book, we don't want to have to create a new API endpoint for book 1 and book 2 and book 3. We want to be able to consume a dynamic path parameter that will return whatever information the user passes in. So let's say we have our application of @app.get/books, but this time we have a function that says async_def read all books, and we have a dynamic param as our parameter for our read all books function. And then we say return dynamic param, and we're going to pass in the dynamic param that's passed in as a parameter. Well, in our API endpoint, we can say /_ dynamic param. Now, let's pay attention to what's going on. When a request comes in of /books/book1, we can see that our API endpoint is /books/_ dynamic param. So that means anything that's at the end of /books or matches this URL, let's grab that last variable and let's transform that into the dynamic param that we're passing in as a parameter. Now, one thing that we need to note is that the API endpoint dynamic param that's in curly brackets needs to match the naming convention that we have as our parameter in our read all books function. So when we do this, we're going to get a response from FastAPI of dynamic param : book1. And that's because book1 is getting passed in as an API endpoint. We're going to grab that dynamic param, which is book1. We are then just going to be passing that variable of book1 and calling it dynamic param, and then we're going to be returning that, which is going to return book1. So dynamic parameters are used often, and we're going to be creating them in this application. Now, one thing to note is that order matters with path parameters. So we have our request of localhost port 8000 /book/mybook. Well, if we have a function first that is /book/dynamic param, and then underneath this we say @app.get book/mybook, well, the very first thing that's going to happen is my book is going to be transformed into the dynamic param of our first function. So our second function will never get called because the first function is accepting the exact same parameter list. So what we need to do is always have the static or the smaller APIs in front, because FastAPI looks in a chronological order from top to bottom to see what matches the URL that's coming in. So what we need to do is reverse the order and say books my book, and then the second function can be the dynamic param. So if my book matches the first function of book/mybook, well then we're going to return book title of my favorite book. And if the last variable in the path is something other than my book, well then the dynamic param is going to catch it. So if it's not my book, the dynamic parameter is going to catch it. And if it is my book, well then the very first static parameter is going to catch it. So we have our path parameters, and right now we're just returning either the static or dynamic data that's getting passed in as the URL. But what we actually want to do is return books. So we have this books list, which is going to have all the books inside. So we're going to call the request by the title and then return that book. When we type in a request that needs a space, we are going to use %20. So we can see our localhost /book/title %24. Now this essentially just means title space 4. So in an API URL, you can't have spaces, so the encoding for a space is %20. So when we say book/title %24, we're going to have our function that takes in a book title. We're going to explicitly say that this book title is going to be of type string. So we're going to say at app.get/books/curly brackets of book title, which is our dynamic parameter. Async def read book title of type string. And then for book and book, so we're going to loop through all of the books. If book.getTitle.casefold, and .casefold is just a stronger .lower function, which will turn everything to lowercase, equals book title.casefold. So we're just making sure that we have matches on our strings. Then we're going to return that book. So the response is going to be that specific book of title for, author for, with our category of math. All right, in the last video, we created all of our books and we created a API endpoint of /books that returns all of the books. Now in this video, we are going to go over path parameters, and a path parameter is a way for us to be able to locate in FastAPI where we want an application to run, and it's just the overall path of a URL. So I'm going to go ahead and do a couple spaces, and then I'm going to create a new function. And this function is also going to be called read all books. So we can go ahead and say async def read all books. And here we want to pass in a parameter called dynamic param. And then we want to return a new dictionary of dynamic param : dynamic param. All right, so this looks like a normal Python method where we're just passing in a dynamic parameter and we're going to be returning that dynamic parameter. Just like we did with /books when we created this API endpoint, we need to do something similar, where this time we're going to have to say at app.get, and inside the parentheses, we're going to say /books, but we're also going to say /curly brackets dynamic param. And now this dynamic param that's located inside this API endpoint is going to match the parameter name of the function underneath. Now FastAPI knows that this dynamic param is going to match the values of the dynamic param that we're passing in the parameter. FastAPI does this all magically behind scenes, and it allows us to easily be able to pass in dynamic data through an API endpoint that we can now use within the function itself. So now if we call this API endpoint of /books/dynamic param, which means we can pass in anything we want, we're going to call this function underneath, pass in whatever we added here, and we're just going to return it. So let's go ahead and just open up our browser and refresh the page, and we can see that we have a new GET request of /books/dynamic param. If we come in here, we can pass in anything we'd want. So I'm going to go ahead and type in science. And if we execute this, we can see that our URL request was books/science because it changed that dynamic param can be anything we want. And now we're saying the dynamic param is science as the response. So again, in our function, we have app.get, which is our API endpoint of /books/curly brackets of dynamic param. Here we passed in science, which makes this dynamic param parameter equal to science, and then we're just returning science. Now there's a couple of things that we need to be aware of. We can also make sure that we have an explicit type attached to this parameter. So we can say :string, which now means dynamic param must be a string. So if we go back into our application now, and we refresh the page, and we say, try it out, and we want to pass in a number 1 right here in the dynamic param, and we click execute, we can see that dynamic param automatically changed this 1 to a string of 1. Now, if we remove that parameter type, it would come back as the number 1, like an integer. But since we added of type string, it's going to be of type string. Now, there's one other thing we want to be aware of, and that's order matters with path parameters. So for example, right under this function, I'm going to create a new function of @app.get /books/mybook. And the function I'm going to say is async def read all books. We're then going to return a dictionary of book title of type my favorite book. So what we can see with this function is that the API endpoint is books/mybook, and it's a static variable. It is not a dynamic parameter. But up here we have books/dynamic parameter. Well, if we wanted to call my books and we went back to our browser and we refresh the page, we can see that I have my books here. But if I try and run it and execute it, it's going to tell me dynamic param of my book. Well, that's because regardless, this URL of /books/mybook is in fact still calling this API endpoint above. And that's because FastAPI looks at all the functions in a chronological order from top to bottom. So when we type in books/mybook, it is thinking books/mybooks as a dynamic parameter. So what we want to do is make sure that we grab this my books and place it ahead of this dynamic parameter. So now when we run my book, it's going to capture this and it's going to grab this function before it also matches here. And then if anything else is passed here that's not my book, we're going to grab the dynamic parameter. So if we go back to our function now, and we refresh the page and we say read all books of my book, we say try it out, we can execute it and it's going to say my favorite book. And down here, if we go ahead and just type in anything other than my book, like history, and we execute this, we're going to see that the dynamic param is now history. All right, so now we can go back and let's just go ahead and delete this. I just wanted to add this so you could see the chronological order. And now here in this app.get of book/dynamic param, let's go ahead and just change this to book title. And here we can see async def, let's just say read book. And as the dynamic param, we want to change this to book title. So what we're doing here is now we just want to get a single book out of the list of books based on the book title that we're passing in as a path parameter. So what we're going to be able to do is go to this endpoint of /books/ and we need to type in the book title. That book title will get grabbed in this function parameter. And then we want to return that book title. And we can do this by saying for book in books, if book.get title.casefold, and casefold is a more powerful way of saying lower, so we're going to make everything lowercase, equal to book title.casefold. So we're making a lowercase string equal to another lowercase string, then return the book. So again, we have our function of async def read book. We're passing in a book title. We're now looping through all the books in books. And when we find a match of a book in books that has the same title that we're passing in as a dynamic path parameter, we're going to return that specific book. So let's go ahead and go back to our Swagger UI. We have our read all books, which is going to return all the books. And then we have this read book, which is book/book title. If we open this up and we say try it out and we pass in title 1 and we execute, we can see that we are getting our book 1 returned, which is title 1, author 1 with a category of science. Now, one thing that stands out is in our request URL, we have this FastAPI application with our port /books title %21. Now, that's interesting. So when we're dealing with our URL, whether that's path parameters or something else, %20 means space. So you can see in our book title, we're passing in title 1. And in our URL, we're saying title %21. And that's because it's adding a space for our application. And again, if we go ahead and grab this and we paste it right here in the browser, we can see that we get our application of title, title 1, author, author 1, and category of science. So we're going to get our object in a JSON format. And here we can see that we get a status code of 200 with the same thing, but just Swagger's making it prettier for us to understand. Now, path parameters are used all the time, so you really want to make sure you understand this concept of being able to pass in something dynamic here, being able to capture it as a parameter, and now you can use it within your application. All right, well, this wraps up everything with path parameters, and I'll see you in the next video. All right, now that we've went over path parameters using our HTTP GET request method, let's go over query parameters. So what are query parameters? Well, query parameters are request parameters that have been attached after a question mark. And query parameters have a name-value pair relationship. So you may be confused on question marks and name and value pairs, so let's go ahead and see an example. Let's go ahead and say we have our localhost port 8000 / books / category equals math. Now we know the URL and port is from FastAPI and we're saying /books as part of the path, but now we can filter by category using the query parameter. So let's look at a new request, and instead of math, we're going to say science. So we're at our localhost port 8000 / books / category equals science. So how does this look in FastAPI and in our Python function? Well, we're going to have our @app.get and we're going to say /books. So we do not have a dynamic path parameter, we just have our normal path that says go to books. We then have our Python function of read category by query, where we pass in a category of type string. We are then going to have an empty books to return, and then we're going to loop through all of the books, and when category of that book matches the query parameter category, we're going to add it to the list and then return that list. And essentially, this is all you have to do. So the category name, which has a value in the URL, needs to match the name of the parameter that we're passing into the function. So you can see in the request, we have category, and in our parameter list, we have category of type string. So then that category of type string will inherit the value of science. Now, query parameters can be used with path parameters. So let's go ahead and say we have a new request of our localhost port 8000 / books, and then we have our dynamic path parameter of /author %20, which means space, 4 / category equals science. So here we can probably assume that we're going to be looking for the author for and their books that they wrote that have a category of science. So if we look at the Python function, we can see that we have a @app.get /books / our dynamic path parameter, which is book author, which is going to inherit author for. And then we're going to have in our parameter book author, which is going to inherit that path parameter, and then category, which is going to inherit the query parameter. So with this, we can see that you can take in a path parameter and you can use a query parameter. So with this, let's dive into the code. All right, in the last video, we created path parameters for our books. And now in this lecture, we're going to go over query parameters. And now think of a query parameter as a way to filter data based on the URL provided. And now we can filter this data after a question mark in the URL. And I'll explain all this in this video. So let's go ahead and say we want to be able to filter our books by category. So we have 2 science books, 1 history book, and 3 math books. So down here, let's go ahead and just say we want a new function of async def read category by query, and we're going to pass in a category parameter of type string. We then want to say books to return is equal to an empty list. And now we want to say for book in books, if book.getCategory.casefold is equal to the category.casefold that we're passing in. So we're looping through all the books and we're looking for a match of a book that has the same category as the category we're passing in as a query parameter. Then we want to say books to return .append book. And then outside the loop, we want to say return books to return. So it's either going to be an empty list or it's going to have books inside based on the parameter category. And at the very top, we want to add a decorator for our path, which is going to be @app.get/books and then a slash at the end. All right, so as you can see in the path parameter, we are passing in something in the URL that we're converting to our parameter in our function. With a query parameter, FastAPI automatically knows that, hey, anything that is passed in after books that is not a dynamic path parameter, we want to convert into whatever parameters we have here within our function. So if we open up our web browser, we can see that we have a new function of get of /books, read category by query. Okay. Well, if we come in here and we say try it out and we type in science and we say execute, we can see that it returned the 2 books that have a category of science. So if we look back into our application and we scroll up to our books, we have 2 books that have a category of science. And down here we say async def read category by query, where we're passing in science as the category. And then we're finding all books that have a category of science and then appending it to our books return and then return that books to return variable, which has all of the books that have a category of science. Okay, cool. But if we look up here, we can see that Swagger automatically added a question mark at the end of books. That's because we're passing in a query parameter for category, which is a name value pair. So we have a name category with a value of science. And FastAPI told Swagger how to do this. So if we look at the very top, it says category string query. If we look at the other API endpoint, it says path because that is a path parameter. And now we're using a query parameter. And we're querying the data by category. And we're passing in the value of science. Now we can use both path parameters and query parameters together. That is used all of the time when trying to figure out additional information. So let's say we also want a function that searches by the author and by category. So if we look up here, we can see that author 2 has 2 books. It has book 2 and book 6, which is a math and a science book. Well, as of right now, we can search by category, which returns both book 1 and 2 by 2 different authors, and we can search by book title. So we can say title 2. But there's no way to say I want to search by the author and I want to filter by the category using a query parameter. So down here, I'm going to make a couple spaces just so I have some more room. We're going to say @app.get/books/ brackets, and we're going to pass in book author as the path parameter. And then under this, we're going to say async def read author category by query. Where book author is of type string, and we're going to get this book author from the URL as a path parameter. And then we're going to add another parameter of category of type string, which is going to come in automatically as a query parameter. We then want to say books to return equals a list. for book and books. If book.getAuthor.casefold is equal to bookAuthor.casefold. And book.getCategory.casefold is equal to category.casefold. All right, and we're going to get a red line because here in Python, when you want to go to another line, you need to make sure you add a slash, which means continue this line of code onto the next line. Then we want books to return to append the book and then return the books to return. All right, so again, we have a API endpoint that says the book's book author. We're converting this book author to book author, and we're passing in category as a query parameter. We have an empty list of books to return. We're looping through every book, and for every match where the author is equal to the book author that we're passing in, and it has a category of the category we're passing in, we want to append that book and return that book. So if we go back to our Swagger UI and we refresh the application, we can see that we have our books by book title, we have our /books, which is our category query that we had, and our book/book author, which is a path parameter and a query parameter. So here we can say try it out and we can pass an author to. And we can say category of science. If we execute this, we can see that we get our book 2 of science because it's a perfect match. And in our URL, we have our FastAPI application and port, and then /books/author %20, which is space 2, and then a query parameter at the end that is category equals science. If we change this to math and we execute it, we're going to get the book of math. If we change this to history, we're just going to get nothing as the response because this author does not have a book in history. Well, this is how we use query parameters and simultaneously path parameters. These are the most common things to use when dealing with get, which is a read command for RESTful APIs. Typically, you're going to be using a path parameter to find the location, and you're going to be using query parameters to now filter whatever data you want to return. Now, this is everything I have for query parameters, and I will see you in the next video. All right, so far we've done get request methods using path parameters and query parameters. Now we're going to move on to a new HTTP request method known as a post request method. So what is a post request method? Well, a post request method is used to create data. Post can have a body that has additional information that GET requests do not have. So an example of a body is we are able to pass in an entire book that is not part of the URL in the request so that our FastAPI application can use it. So for example, you can see that we have a new book of Title 7 with an author of 2 and category of math. So our author 2 created a new book, which is called Title 7. And we're able to pass this request as a post to our backend application, which is our FastAPI. So let's take a closer look. So our request might be just our localhost port 8000/books/create-book. So we're not using any kind of query parameters and we're not using any kind of dynamic path parameters. So our function is going to be @app.post. So instead of .get, we're using .post. and then /books/create_book. We then have a new Python function of async def create book, and we're passing in a new variable called new book. Well, this new book is going to be equal to body. Therefore, the new book variable is going to be equal to whatever we're passing in as the body of this post request. Well, we know that this body is going to be exact same information of a new book. So then we can just go ahead and say books.append to the new book, because new book is that new book that we're passing in as the body. So with all this, let's go ahead and just dive into code so we can create our first post request method. All right, so far we've went through path parameters and query parameters, and now we're going to go over a new type of HTTP request method that instead of GET, we are going to be using POST. Now, POST is the create HTTP request method. It's a way for us to be able to send more data through an API endpoint so that we can essentially be able to create pieces of data. And how we're going to be using this is by creating a new book to add to our list. Now, if we scroll to the top, we can see that a book requires a title with a value, an author with a value, and a category with a value. So we essentially need 3 pieces of data, and it's getting sent as a dictionary. Well, so far we've only been able to pass data through the URL as a path parameter and or a query parameter. Now, a post request has an additional area to be able to send data called the body. And you can send data in the body that can now be used by FastAPI. To be able to use a body of a request, we need to make sure that we import body from FastAPI. Once we have body imported, we can now essentially use additional information from a request that GET requests do not have. So I want to make that clear that GET requests do not have a body regardless if we import a body. It's just how the client in the server, which is FastAPI, and the website are able to communicate. A GET cannot have a body, but a POST can. So right under this last function, let's go ahead and say @app.post. And here we're going to say double quotation marks /books/create book. So we're not passing in any type of path parameter or query parameter. We then want to say async def create book. And here we're going to pass in as a parameter new book equals body. And then we want to say books.append the new book. So what we're essentially saying is when we call this post, we're saying inside this request's body, there's going to be data that we want to convert to the new book. And then we want to append this new book to our books. So if we save the application and we go back to our Swagger documentation, we can see that we have 4 GET requests, and now we have a new post request of /books/create book. Let's open this up, and here we can see that there's no parameters, which means information that's getting passed in the URL, but we do now have a request body that is required. And we need to say try it out, and now we can pass something in as the body, which is a lot bigger than the parameter space that we get. So here we want to essentially create a new book. So let's go ahead and say curly brackets, double quotation marks, title, title 7, comma, author, author 2, comma, category, math. And make sure that in the request body, when we're dealing with strings, it's a double quotation mark and not a single quote. In Python, we can use double quotes or single quotes, but when we're passing it in as a request body, we must use a double quotation mark. And now let's go ahead and say execute. So when we click execute, we can see that we do a curl where we're doing a call to our API endpoint of /books create book. We have our header information, which is automatically added, and then our body is going to have this dictionary that we just passed in above. We can see that we get a response body of null, and that's because we're not returning anything from our API endpoint, but we are getting a status code of 200. So if we look at this, we added a new book of title 7 from our author 2 category math. If we come back up here and we say read all books and we execute it, we can see that there is now a new book at the very end, which is called title 7 from author 2, which is of math. Perfect. So we have our new book and our post request worked. Now I do want to show you that if we came up here into our Git, and let's say a little easier one like book title. If we came over here and we said, comma, new book is equal to body, it will compile. So if we come back to our application, we can see that we said search by book title, and it looks like we're going to have our request body because the application still will compile. Now, if we try it out and we say title 1, and we can just leave the request body as a string and we click execute, we're going to get an error from the server, which is our FastAPI application, that says request with get method cannot have a body. So this is me just wanting to show you that gets cannot have a body. So even though it compiles, it cannot have a body. So let's go ahead and just remove that. And if we look back at our post, we can see that this is allowed to have a body. So new book is equal to the body that we're passing in, which is going to be a book, and we're appending the book. Now, of course, if we add new book to not equal what this book is expecting, so if we don't have a dictionary of all this kind of stuff, we will have an internal error because our Python application will break, because we want to make sure that this is the exact same. But that is for a different conversation on how to handle errors. But just as of right now, we want to just make sure that, hey, we are looking at the body, we are passing in a book, and we are appending that book to the end of books. And that's essentially how you use a post. This wraps up the post request method, and I will see you in the next video. So we've covered GET request methods and we've covered post request methods, but now let's go ahead and cover put HTTP request methods. So what is a put request method? Well, a put request method is used to update data. A put can have a body that has additional information like a post that GET does not have. So an example of a body for a put is going to look exactly like the body of a post. So for example, instead of creating a new book, we're going to pass in a book that already exists, but we're going to be able to change the category or the author because we're going to look at the titles of the two books and then change the author or category or whichever has changed. So let's go ahead and look at a put request method. So if you remember, a put is an update, and we're going to have our localhost with port 8000 /books and then /update book, which is a non-dynamic path parameter. We are then going to write a new function within our FastAPI application where we're going to be using @app.put, and our path is going to be book/update book. And then we're going to have our function of async def update book, where we're going to create a new variable of updated book as a parameter, which is equal to the body that we're passing in. And then for I in range of the length of books, we're going to look at each book to see if the title.casefold matches the updated book that we're passing in as the body. And if it does, then we're just going to swap out that location with the new book and update that location within the list with the new book. So a put and a post are pretty similar when it comes to being able to have body information, but we just got to remember that post is for creating data, while a put is for updating data. And with that, let's dive into the code and create our first put request method. All right, so just moving along with project 1, we have our get request methods, which are using path parameters and query parameters. And we have our post request method, which is creating a new book, and then we're appending it to books. Now, in this video, we are going to use the put request method. Now, put is equivalent to update. So we are going to want to update a book or change some information about a specific book. So what we want to do is we also want to use the body that we're using for our post, pass in a book, and we want to match where the titles match and then change the rest of the information. So we're not essentially able to change the title, but we can change the author and we can change the category. So let's go ahead and say app.put/books/update book. And under this, we're going to say async def update book, and we're going to pass in an updated book, which is equal to body. We then want to say for I in range of length of books. So we're going to see how many items are in the books. If books of I.getTitle.casefold is equal to updated book.getTitle.casefold. Well, then we want to say books I equals updated book. So we're looping through all the books to find a match on the title. And then we're essentially changing the information in that list of books to the new book. All right, so now we can go ahead and open up our browser. And before that, I just want to make it clear that I do have my terminal still running. So make sure your application is running. And now let's go back to our browser and refresh the page. And we can see that we have a new put request method, which is orange under our green post. So if we go ahead and just say read all books to start off, we can see that we have book 1 all the way to book 6. So let's go ahead and change book 6. And let's change the category to history. As we can see, the category is currently math. So down here, let's go ahead and say try it out, where we're going to pass in something in the request body. And I'm actually just going to come up here and just copy this. Go back down here, paste it. And I'm going to change the category to history. All right, so we have our title, title 6, author, author 2, in category of history. If we execute this, we can see we get a 200 and a null. We're passing in a new body. And we're calling our books update book. And we can see that title 6 now has the category of history. And that's because we have our put where we're passing in a body and we're looping through all elements in the book. And then we're saying where the titles match, we want to update the book at that specific index. But this is how you use a put. A put can also take in a body like a post, and we can just update pieces of information inside the list or the application itself. All right, well, this wraps up everything to do with puts, and I will see you in the next video. All right, so we're almost done with project 1, where we've went over get request methods, post request methods, put request methods, and now we're going to go over delete request methods. So what is the delete request method? Well, if you had one guess, you'd probably get it right, and it's used to delete data. So if we have a request of localhost port 8000 /books/delete book, we can then attach a path parameter of book title, which will essentially delete that book from the list. And we can write a function that will do that. But the first thing we need to notice is that we have an @app.delete, and then we have our API endpoint of /books/delete book/book title, where we say async def delete book, and we're passing in book title because that's what our dynamic path parameter is. And then we're looping through all the books until we get a match on the title, and then we're just going to delete that book from the list, and then we're going to break out of the loop. All right, so this is a pretty simple function, and let's dive into the code and write our delete API endpoint. All right, so far for project 1, we went over path and query parameters using the get request method. We've been able to create books using the post request method and update books using the put request method. Now, the last one that we need to implement for project 1 is the delete request method. So we can go ahead and just create a new function of @app.delete. And inside here, we want to say /books/delete book/book title. And now the book title is going to be a path parameter. And then under this, let's go ahead and say async def delete book, and we're going to pass in our book title of type string. So our path parameter will be able to be converted to a parameter that we can use in the application. And then let's say for I in range of length of books. If books of I.getTitle.caseFold is equal to bookTitle.caseFold, well, then we want to go ahead and say books.popI, which will remove that element from the list, and then we want to break out of the loop. All right, and now once we save this, let's go ahead and open up our browser. I'm going to refresh the page. And if we go ahead and say try it out for read all books, we can see that we're going to have all the books. So title 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Now we can scroll down to our new delete function, which is a red Swagger UI. We can say try it out, and we can type in a book. So I'm just going to say title 4. Execute. We can see that we're going to get our URL of /books/delete book title %24. And we have a response of null. And now if we come back up to our read all books and we execute this, we can see that we have title 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6, and 4 is successfully removed. So now that we just added our delete functionality to our project 1, we can now search by path parameter. We also went over query parameters. We can use post, put, and delete. And we just hit the basics of FastAPI and RESTful applications. So with that, congratulate yourself, and I'll see you in the next video. All right, let's go ahead and solve this problem regarding project 1. So the problem is to get all books from a specific author using path or query parameters. So we need to create a new endpoint that'll get all the books for a specific author. Well, if we scroll up, we can see that the only author that has more than one book is author 2. So if we type in author 2, it should get 2 books. If we type in any of the other authors, it should get 1 book. And if we type in an author that does not exist, we should get 0 books. So let's go ahead and write a new Python function starting with the decorator at the top, which is @app.get /books/by_author/author. So we're going to first do the path parameter solution. And then let's go ahead and say async def read books by author path. And I'm going to pass in author of type string as the parameter. And then we want to go ahead and say books to return equals an empty list. for book in books, if book.getAuthor.casefold is equal to author.casefold, well, then we want to go ahead and say books to return dot append book and then return our books to return. All right, so I'm going to go into my terminal and I'm going to start up my server by saying unicorn books :app -- reload. And now I'm going to go back into our browsers and refresh the page. And right under our delete, we're going to get a new get of books by author, where we can just say try it out and type in author 2. If we say execute, we can see that we get the 2 books from author 2. And if we change this to author 1, we're going to get the 1 book by author 1. We can see that we're using a path parameter here based on this type at the very top. And we can see the URL is doing books by author %21, which is all within the path. If we wanted to go ahead and just make this use a query parameter, we can just delete this ending right here. So now when there is no dynamic path, then FastAPI will automatically think that this is a query parameter, which is correct. So if we go back into here and refresh and we go back into that exact function, we can see that the author is now a query with an author. So if we say try it out here and we say author 2, you might think that this will work, but we are going to get an error. It's going to say unprocessable entity with a description of value error missing. So if we look at this, we can see that we have the right path of books by author and then author equals author %22. So this all looks right, but this goes right back to the very beginning of order matters. So this app.get and then passing in a query parameter is going to interfere with up here where we say book author, and it's expecting another parameter. Now, this might be slightly confusing, but what we want to do is move this ahead of here. So if we come back down here and we grab this, and we scroll up and we move it above this query parameter with this path parameter, and we drop it right here. Now, when we run this application and we say author 2, we're going to get our authors. And if we come up here and we say filter by book and category, and we say author 2 by science, and we execute, this will still work as well. So order matters a ton in FastAPI, especially if you're going to be using one file and it's in chronological order. The reason this errored out because saying books by author as a GET request properly fulfilled this requirement of books/book author. So then when we passed in a variable of author, it filled this in, and then it's saying we were missing an extra field. So we always want to make sure that the smaller API endpoints are always in the front of the file, because if not, it could get consumed by a longer endpoint that takes in more variables. So that's something to always keep in the back of your mind when dealing with FastAPI, is that we need to make sure that, hey, if a first error is happening and it doesn't really make sense, that's because you might not even be calling the correct API endpoint. So that's just something in the back of your head. I wanted to make sure this problem made you think a little bit, and hopefully you're able to get through it. And if not, you just learned something from this solution. So with that, this wraps up Project 1, and I'll see you in the next video.